Since last week, our friend Sophia wrote to me and asked whether I mightn't consider giving a few lectures on Hegel, which I've always meant to do, online lectures, that is, because I don't think you can sufficiently understand Roger Scruton, or indeed not only the book that we are discussing, but his philosophy more generally, without understanding Hegel. And I don't think you can understand modern philosophy from 1900 to now in any of the spheres without an appreciation of Hegel. So I'll talk more to Fisher about that, and we'll let you know where that goes. In the meantime, I said last week that when I encouraged Roger to write the updated version, and it really is an updated version of the Thinkers of the New Left, I really, just reading it again now, this Fools, Frauds and Firebrands, I really am ashamed of myself, actually, because imagine having, at an advanced age, having to sit down and read all these people again. It's nothing less than a severe punishment. And he did it. When I was young, younger than I am now anyway, I lectured on all of these characters and wrote about them and read them, and even I find it difficult to wade through them again in preparation for this event. But it is sobering to know, or to note, that you do so knowing that there are thousands of people around our world, young people, impressionable people, who swallow this as gospel and who take it to mean something more than it actually does, i.e. something that's going to offer them direction for their lives. And I think that was Roger's main impetus, his main objective in writing this book, and indeed criticizing these people, again, not from, as I said, wild or, fundamentalist perspective. He gets into the works, he dissects them, he tears them apart from inside, because, as I said to you last week, he comes out of that tradition, the same tradition. And as I said, just to remind you once more, he is the faithful son of Hegel, although he wouldn't admit it always, and that we'll come to in our last session in 2 weeks' time, but he wouldn't admit that always. But he was, and they were not. They were, as I said last week, the prodigals. But in the midst of it all, as in all his works, and this is how I'll start this evening before getting more in depth into this, there is humor, always humor with him, and it's a humor that's not based on anything but sheer comedy. For example, when I bring the case up of this book in our book Conversations with Roger Scruton, I say the following, and I quote from page 106, 107 for those of you who have the work. I remind Scruton that when people like Sartre, Foucault and Bataille were not obsessing about Marxism, they were obsessing about sex. Yes, of course they were, says Scruton. Marxism was there in the background all the time, but they inherited it from Baudelaire, the ideal of the morale du mal, the morality of evil, which they presented as a kind of redemptive cause. Witness Sartre's canonization of the thief, Jean Genet. What remains to us after all the treasons of the Second World War? At least this remains, this posture of absolute denial. And this is what grips the American professor when he comes across the literature of 1968. He encounters French intellectual life in the form of magic liturgical pronouncements. Lacan casts spells against reality, and lo, reality disappears. There is no sexual relation, says Lacan. And the professor falls back in his chair and says, God, did you hear what he said? There is no sexual relation. All Lacan is like that. You don't exist, he declares. And his apostles claim, yeah, you're right, we don't exist. Reality is just swept away, and fantasy is put in the place of it. So just one little example of catching Lacan by the coattails and pulling the feet from under him. Of course, you probably read when you came to the piece on Žižek, this wonderful comment of his on page 260 of Fools, where he says, if Žižek had stayed in Slovenia, and if Slovenia had stayed communist, he would not have become the nuisance he has since become. Indeed, if there were no greater reason to regret the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, the release of Žižek on the world of Western scholarship would perhaps already be a sufficient one. And indeed, so say I. Elsewhere, he writes of, in both Conversations on Roger Scruton and in a very early work called The Politics of Culture, there's an essay in that on Foucault, for example, just called A Note on Foucault. I'm including it in the next Scruton book, Last Words. Remember, 1971, that's 50 years ago now, where he writes approvingly of Foucault as a scholar, as a writer, as a historian, as somebody who had, great intellectual bravura, and yet was still wrong. But nonetheless, so this is how far it goes back. It goes right back 50 years he's been writing about these people. This is nothing new. He doesn't take them up in any latter-day way. They've been there from the beginning. But tonight especially, we want to talk about the French Firebrands. And again, we must, in order to understand where they're coming from, we must return to Hegel, briefly. Because tonight I want to give you a short history of otherness, as it's called, as I will call it, a short history of otherness, and tell you what that means and why it's important and why it is the mantra for these characters that we're discussing this evening. For all of them, Hegel represented an attempt to systematically encompass everything within the frame of consciousness, everything. And the appropriate word there is system, systematically. Hegel's whole dialectical adventure that we all go on, by the way, we all start out as infants and we move progressively in stages of consciousness towards what Hegel called absolute knowledge, by which he did not mean an all-encompassing view of everything. Rather, it meant coming to know the world to such a point where it smiles back at you with a human face, where there's no alienation between you and the things of this world or other people, where you're so totally at home in the world that it becomes your own. That's what he means when he talks about absolute knowledge. That point at which the world becomes so domesticated in your consciousness and begins to reflect all these human features in its very fabric. That's what he means by absolute knowledge. And we all experience that. Those of us who don't are, says Hegel, in a state of alienation or in a state of estrangement. And we've got a little bit of work yet to do, but the quest for human freedom is enough and the quest for seeing oneself in the world, recognizing oneself in the world and in the world around you, that is enough to propel you towards the ultimate goal of that freedom. And I say it's freedom because when we are that comfortable in the world, when the world reflects ourselves and our values, when it reflects our conscious awareness, then we are free. And it's a real freedom because it's mediated through the institutions of the world, which also have a human face. We recognize them, we love them, and if we don't like them, we can sue them. They too are persons. They are accountable. They can be sued. They stand before us like people, accountable, and yet calling on us to respond, to have responsibility towards them. Now that for these people that we're discussing this evening is totalization. It's a vast system of consciousness kind of omnivorously ingesting and consuming everything that human desire lays its eyes upon. So when I desire the other person, for example, there isn't this loss of self where I die to myself, as in a marriage situation, let's say. I die to myself. I embrace the other person dies to herself, embraces me, and out of that mutual synthesis is a third, a new identity. I surrender my identity, she surrenders her identity, we mediate, we become a new entity. And that idea is the bedrock of what we call Hegel's system or Hegel's dialectic. Every time I desire something, I wish to seek myself, I seek recognition, I seek to overcome the alienation that separates me from it, no matter what it is, whether it be food, whether it be art, whether it be anything in the world. I die to myself, I engage with it, it dies to itself, and we produce something new. Think of a book. Think of anything that you engage with as you're developing along life's way. You take up the book. You die to oneself. You enter into the book. Now, what's in the book? Another consciousness. It's a dormant consciousness until you take up the book. Once you enter the book and you engage the book, then that consciousness and your consciousness synthesize. The book will not impart what it imparted to the person who previously read it, let's say. You will take it from your perspective and make something new of it. But it will become part of you, and your taking it will become part of it and its legacy. It'll be a third, something new. And the book itself will be discardable. It is only an entity after all. But what will remain with you is the consciousness that was latent in it. And that's always the way it is. But you see, the thing about it is that for these people, that is to deny the otherness in that book. That is to deny the otherness of the other person. That is to deny the otherness of the world around us. So if Hegel is the great expositor of identity, the people that we're discussing this evening are the great champions of otherness and difference. If he is the great champion of reconciliation, they are the great advocates of alienation and estrangement. If he is the great champion of atonement, they are the great champions of fallenness. And we'll come back to that in a moment. If he, like Roger espouses somewhere, all they can talk about is nowhere and nothingness. Hegel's is a process of domestication, making one's own. They are in the process of repudiating home in favor of homelessness. Now, how do they do this? And this will give you a handy hook to grasp all of them, because it is quite daunting to face into each of them and to see the various nuances between them. But here's a little roadmap for you, just so you can move through this with a kind of, as I say, a short history of otherness, or a guide for the perplexed. Once Hegel had written his great works, immediately, there sprung up a whole industry around trying to identify what it was that couldn't be brought home, what it was that was alien to consciousness, what it was that resisted consciousness. And it began in an unlikely quarter in Copenhagen, in Denmark, under the quill of Søren Kierkegaard, the great thinker of the single individual. And ultimately what Kierkegaard tells us is that there is one thing, apart from the single individual, that Hegel cannot encompass within his system, and that is the wholly other, the wholly other. It's known more euphemistically as God, the wholly other. Not H-O-L-Y, but W-H-O-L-L-Y. Absolutely other. Now, of course, the fact that something is wholly other means that it is unknowable. It cannot be circumscribed within the confines of reason or consciousness. But already it starts to break down, as you can see, because we already recognize it as the wholly other. You know, it's not wholly other. Once it's posited, that notion starts to break down. We recognize it as wholly other and have a relationship to it. Now it is infinite, and it determines who I am as a finite creature. It's already brought within the circle of the same. It's already drawn into the dialectic of consciousness. It's already part of who I am. It's so wholly other, so infinite, that it gives me an identity as a finite person. It's against that which, in relation to which, and against that which, I define myself as a finite being. It didn't matter, doesn't matter. Greater efforts were needed. And so we have Nietzsche, who's the first person to talk about the other to reason, the other to reason. Madness is the other to reason. Unreason is the other to reason. Death is the other to reason. And so right from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, right down through the 19th century, right into Heidegger and Sartre, then into Foucault, Althusser, Lacan, who we'll discuss in a minute. You have this constant effort to show how there was a certain aspect of conscious life and experience that Hegel could not master, or his system could not encompass. And thus, as a way of pouring scorn on anything that was settled or anything that came under the broad rubric of identity, there were things that could not be reconciled to consciousness, in other words. There were things that exceeded it. And thus the human subject was, as a result, not fulfilled, not reconciled with the world and others in its totality. The human subject was broken, decentered, ruptured. We became strangers to ourselves. Now, if you detect a theological dimension to this, you're dead right. Because at one level, it's all about theology for these people. The background noise, anyway. Because in Hegel, his logic, his book, simply called The Logic, uses the Holy Trinity as the basis of that logic. Once again, according to the dialectical scheme I gave you a moment ago, we have the Father, who dies to himself, pours himself out into the world, becomes the Son. The Son acquires its identity, his identity, through the Father. The Son dies to himself on the cross. And through the resurrection, the two become one in the Holy Spirit. The very same format, the very same procedure that occurs when we merely come into contact with something else that we desire and desire to be recognized in and through. Which is why Marx and Derrida and others are so obsessed with what Marx called the Holy Family. This notion that somehow everything is domesticated within this kind of holy logic. Like this time I'm saying H-O-L-Y, this holy logic, that needs to be disrupted. It's the basis of the family, it's the basis of conscious awareness, it's the basis of the theological bedrock of Western civilization. And it's the basis of Hegelian logic, of course. It must go. At least it must be defied. And what we've already cottoned onto the fact now that Kierkegaard, you can't say something is wholly other, because then you have Hegel's rejoinder, well, it can't be wholly other because we recognize it already as wholly other. It has an identity. So what do? We've got to get to a point where this, whatever it is that we're positing, lies so beyond the ken of reason that it just cannot withstand the resistance. It's going to resist consciousness and resist consciousness and resist consciousness. To the point where there is no reconciliation with the Father at all. We are totally cut from our origins. Severed from our origins. Desire is never totally fulfilled. There is no union of subject and object, ultimately. And if, of course, you can't close the circle, if you cannot come to that point of the union of subject and object where the world smiles back at you with a human face, well, then self-recognition is a delusion. A delusion. And the basis of the community is destroyed, of the state is destroyed. It's shattered. And you let loose a form of otherness that will serve only to debunk, decenter, disrupt, disturb our settled ways of life and our belief that we have reconciled with the world in a way that makes us complacent and bourgeois. So what do we have to get to? We have got to get to that point where we have what these people call an unrepresentable before. These are all slogans which I'll unpack very quickly in a moment. Unrepresentable before, something that came before consciousness that can't be represented in consciousness, that cannot succumb to this conscious movement towards fulfillment that Hegel talks about, and Hegel, the journey that Hegel brings us on. Again, more of which I went into last week. Derrida calls it the past which has never been present. He calls this which cannot be, which resists Hegel's logic, which resists Hegel's system. Emmanuel Levinas, who is omitted from this work, but is kind of the prophet of postmodernism. He talks about something that's older than being, that's more ancient than being itself. That cannot be brought into the circle of the same. So here, I'm going to give you one example, one great example that hopefully will bring all this together. And that is the example of Lacan, Jacques Lacan. Now, I remember Jacques Lacan is noteworthy not only for causing absolute mayhem within the academy, but he also, I remember the great French thinker, Paul Ricoeur, who was probably the most sober person of that group. He was a saint, really, in many ways. He was a pious Protestant, wrote some wonderful works, and yet had to frequent all these individuals, one of whom, as you now know, murdered his wife, the other who flung himself out of his apartment window. But yet there was Ricoeur in the middle of it. And Ricoeur told me one time how he took a lift, himself and his wife, off Lacan, and how Lacan summarily left them on the side of the road when he got a phone call from one of his mistresses. Just abandoned these poor old people. And of course, if you saw them, you'd realize how horrendous this was. One of many thousands of examples how awful as a human being Lacan was. But his influence is widespread, despite the fact that even Noam Chomsky, who knew him also, and said I kind of liked him, he said, but he was an utter charlatan of the worst order. But how that didn't stop him being so influential, that he is the great figure that influences Žižek and Badiou, for example. But what does he say, and how does he go about deconstructing Hegel? And this will help you to understand both Hegel and Lacan and see how the misery that Lacan and this type of thinking causes. Now, by the way, in the Politics of Culture, Roger also has a very interesting article from 1978, which forms the bedrock of the one in Fools, called just simply Jacques Lacan. I've yet to decide whether to put it into the new thing, but we'll see. Lacan says that at the very formative stages of existence, when you're an infant, you grope around for identity, just like Hegel does, and like the example I gave you last week of the child playing with the bricks. But all of a sudden, at a certain point, when this quest for identity becomes so overpowering for the infant, by sheer chance, and we all experience this, he says, we catch sight of ourselves in a mirror. And that is what Lacan calls the aha moment. It's called the mirror stage of existence. You recognize yourself in the world, objectified in the world, and thus is born the ego or the I, the subject. It's called the imago. Now, for Lacan, this is a fantasy, and it's a fantasy that haunts the intellectuals. It haunts the world because it's not the true self. It's not the real I. It is for Hegel. It is for Hegel, but it's born of desire, and it's not in a mirror, because Hegel actually sees the infant sees itself reflected in the world through work and engagement with the world, through concrete labor, by playing and molding and grasping and seeing itself, identifying itself in the world, and so on. But the mirror stage of existence gives us this sense of security, this sense of domestication. But of course, for Lacan, it's all a lie. And what happens is, as time goes on, the delusions become more apparent to the self, who's forever unfulfilled, who's never happy, because the Hegelian dialectic does not satisfy. It doesn't satisfy for Althusser, it doesn't satisfy for Lacan, because it, again, as I said to you last week, it is alienation for these people. And the further you go in it through art, religion, and philosophy, the more estranged from reality you become, because you are more estranged from the material conditions that surround you. But for Lacan, it's something different. In opposing Hegelian desire and this notion of recognition that I've been pondering these last couple of weeks, this false self that that we catch sight of in the mirror, which Lacan refers to as the little other, it becomes unhinged, or it experiences this estrangement and this alienation. And thus it goes in search of therapy. And the Lacanian psychoanalyst says, and I'm knocking this down to its bare essentials, of course. When you go to a Lacanian psychoanalyst, the purpose is not to reconcile you with yourself or your real self, as distinct from the false self that you've been living with from the time you were an infant. Oh no, the thing to do is not to reconcile you at all. It's to decenter you, to break apart this sense of I and the sense of ego that you have falsely acquired through this mirror stage of existence. And you do so through talking, language. And there's a way of decentering the subject. The first thing you've got to understand is, according to Lacan, that the unconscious is structured like a language. What does that mean? Well, the unconscious is not the place where if you go down deep enough, you're going to find your cure, or you're going to come face to face with it, because that would again be to bring the unconscious into the conscious. It would be to domesticate it. You certainly cannot do that. That's only getting back to square one. The unconscious is structured like a language, therefore. That comes from structuralist, and don't mind, these are all just names I'm giving them, just know for now. This is called structuralist linguistics, where signs in any language, any signs, any words, do not refer to anything outside of themselves. They refer only to other words. Black refers only to white, white refers only to brown, and so forth. There's nothing outside of the system of signifiers, a signified in other words, to which these words attach. They change over time, they've got a history, and if they did not change, then they probably might get stuck on something as a natural word to a thing, but they don't. They drift and they change and they refer only to one another. So if the unconscious is structured like a language, and if you go in to be cured of your false self, the thing to do is to get down to that point where you realize that your unconscious is a matter of signs referring to other signs or words referring only to other words. And you're never going to recover from that, because all you will do when you start speaking, when you burrow down deep enough, is wordplay. You won't be brought to the point where you say, the unconscious has spoken in its true essence. You are healed. There's your trauma. You will simply speak. And they will be one word drifting off to another word, gibberish. For example, when you go into the Lacanian analyst chair, the analyst more often than not will say nothing. They won't guide you. They won't ask you questions. They will unsettle you, decenter you, until the embarrassment of the silence becomes so intense that you'll blurt things out. Wordplay. And what you blurt out will not be intentional. It'll just be something to break the silence or to get over your nervousness. And now we've tapped into the unconscious. Okay? The purpose isn't to get you right. The purpose is to let you go free, so that the wordplay is all that there is. If the language is structured, the Lacanian isn't doing his job. So it has to be kind of contrived stuff where the analyst makes the analyse and so uncomfortable that these things bubble up from wherever and make no sense and are what they are. An expression of the unconscious, which is structured like a language. Now, this means that the language speaks through us. We don't dominate the discourse. We cannot control it. This is the big other. It cannot be circumscribed within the context of or the sphere of consciousness. It defies consciousness. It's a decentering of the subject, which is why Lacan famously said, "There's no, we must decenter time in the context of therapy." So he'd march in, he'd sit there, he'd say nothing, and then he'd march out after 5 minutes. And the subject, who's there paying good money for this, would be so unsettled by it, he'd run out crying or something, or become miserable. But that is the point. Now you're decentered. Now you're into the free play. Okay, you're no longer caught up with the imago, which I'm seeing in my own computer here, of myself. Now the unconscious is structured like a language, and therefore you are being spoken through. You can never master that. You can never conscious of that in the sense of Hegelian domestication, but it becomes your true self, if there is such a thing. And what's more, Lacan puts another thing that's even further removed from consciousness, which he calls the real, or EAL, the real, which is kind of this mystical darkness that can never be tapped into outside of language. It's that other beyond language, which language may be referring to, but may not, and splits the subject entirely. So you can see now that these things are so beyond, so removed, so beyond consciousness's capacity to recognize, to master, to control, to systematize, to totalize, to recognize, that they forever break the subject. And what's let loose is this jouissance, that famous phrase of joy. The real self is a no self. Madness. There is no reunion of subject and object. There is no reconnection with the world. There is no reconnection with the self. There is no reconnection with the object. There is no reconnection with home. It's all cut, cut, cut. No pun intended at all. Why the trope of circumcision is so, available in the writings of these people. Derrida writes a book, a rather good book, but the meaning of which I won't explain here because not within our remit, but Circumfession, based on a play on Augustine's Confessions, where the confession is cut. We're cut from the origin, where St. Augustine is confessing to God and thus desiring God and fulfilling his need for God. Circumfession, cut away, because we can never reach the past, which has never been present. We can never reach the unpresentable before. We can never reach the big other, as Lacan calls it. And thus the whole process of reunion is broken apart. The Hegelian logic falls asunder. Hegelian logic, which we all depend on to know, by the way, at the most basic level, gone. No return to the Father. And this is what in Hegel's dialectic he calls unhappy consciousness, where he uses the image of Abraham wandering around a stranger, he says, to men and the soil alike. So for him, it's unhappy consciousness. For them, it's jouissance, revel in it, which is why you have all sorts of perversions and obscenities masquerading as a discovery of self, right down from the Marquis de Sade, right through Foucault, who, as you probably know, discovered, much to his absolute euphoria, the bathhouses, the gay bathhouses of San Francisco in the late 70s, early 80s, and reveled there in the final years of his life, contracting AIDS. And the big question was, because he knew he had AIDS towards the end, and he went back to San Francisco, and he continued to use those baths, did he knowingly infect other people? It was put to him in a question shortly before he died in 1984 of AIDS-related disease, brought on by sepsis. It was put to him whether his answer was that this was a limit experience where you're taken to the threshold of this jouissance. And of course, do the consequences bear thinking about in such circumstances? If it's a limit moment of transgression, which is what they're all about, transgressing the boundaries, transgressing the home, transgressing the order of reason, and so on and so forth, we do not know. However, one thing is for sure, that the other is unleashed by these people. And you see this in Foucault, in his Mad Men, in his the history of madness and civilization, where all of these episodes of madness throughout the epochs come back to disturb the insane, the criminally insane, the ship of fools. All of these things come back to upset, to disturb, to uproot the domestic order or the settled order. Unreason, otherness. And you see it today, and I'll end with this politically, where the other is given prominence over the same. Still. So the settled order of America, for example, has to be rewritten on the basis of the other. And that other takes different forms. Because the system, and they still use the same terminology as they did when they were accusing Hegel of totalization, the system has been built on the exclusion of this otherness. Those who are considered insane, different, inferior, of a different kind, big other, little other, whatever it might be. And the whole process of postmodernism, the whole process of this type of thinking, is to break apart the order of consciousness so that this unconscious, this big other, can come through. which is why we need to rewrite our history, why we need to reevaluate our civilization, why we need to ban certain artworks, statues, opera, whatever it is, books that offend. Who do they offend? The other. The Holy Family has been shattered. The return to the same has been destroyed, they think. And in the process, any means will do to allow that other to be liberated, any means. So whether it is Žižek sneering at the settled intellectual community, of which he's a member, by the way, that, you know, joyously, exuberantly wallowing in the excesses of Maximilian Robespierre as a kind of a pure revolution. And as Roger says, you don't know whether he's actually joking or not. And if he is joking, it's in bad taste. But that's what it means when the new Jacobins take control. It means that the order, it doesn't matter. You see, the fact that we've lost theology, we've lost religion, they need a new cause, and the new cause has to be the other. The new cause has to be the proletariat. And it gives one kind of a moral authority to speak about things in the absence of God. Nowhere, nothingness, jouissance, pleasure, insanity, disturbance, excess, brokenness. All the things of the adolescent life become now the norm. I'll leave it there now, Fisher, and we can move to questions.